I had spent nearly a decade serving my country through scorching deserts and icy nights, through the deafening roar of helicopters and the silence of outposts where every shadow could mean death. And when I finally came home, I thought that Christmas would be my moment of peace, the time when I could walk up the front steps of the house where I was raised and finally feel just once that I belonged. Instead, only a few days before I was supposed to step on that porch, my phone buzzed with a message from my father, Richard Bennett, the man whose approval I had chased since I was a little girl shoveling snow in the driveway, while my older brother Daniel laughed from the warmth of the living room. The message was only 8 words long, but they cut deeper than any shrapnel wound I had carried back from the field. "You're not welcome here this Christmas. Stay away." I read them again and again, each repetition hammering into me like the recoil of a weapon, each syllable stripping another piece of hope from my chest. My knees buckled, and I sat on the floor of my small apartment staring at the blinking screen as if it might take the words back, as if some glitch would correct the cruelty. But there was no glitch. It was deliberate. It was a sentence passed down from a man who had always valued his son more than his daughter, from a father who had never forgiven me for not being born a boy, from the patriarch who measured worth in obedience and silence. I wanted to scream, but my voice stayed buried in my throat, choked by the years I had spent trying to prove I was enough. I remembered the Christmas mornings overseas when I patched up wounded soldiers instead of opening presents, the times I wired money home so the mortgage would be paid and my mother Margaret could have her medication, the birthdays missed the scars collected, the medals I folded into a drawer because they never seemed to matter to anyone back home. And now this rejection delivered not face to face, but through a cold text message, a digital execution of whatever tie I had clung to. I had imagined the smell of pine and cinnamon, the sound of carols on the radio, the awkward laughter of a family trying to rebuild what years of distance had frayed. I had hoped that for once my father might look at me the way he looked at Daniel, with pride instead of suspicion, with warmth instead of icy command. I had prayed that this year would be different, that I would not be the ghost in the corner of the living room while my brother basked in the glow of admiration. That fragile dream shattered in the glow of my phone screen, leaving shards sharp enough to draw blood if I dared to touch them. I pressed the phone to my chest and tried to breathe, but the words carved themselves deeper with every exhale. "You're not welcome. Not just unwelcome for dinner. Not just excluded from a ritual, but unwelcome in the very place I had bled and sacrificed to protect." The irony burned because I had faced enemies who wore uniforms and carried rifles, but I had never expected the deadliest wound to come from my own blood. The rejection was not passive. It was intentional, brutal, final. It told me that no matter what I had endured, no matter the stripes on my sleeve or the nights I lay awake listening for mortar fire, I would never be equal to the golden sun. It told me that my father would rather erase me than acknowledge that his daughter had given everything. That night, I sat in the dark with only the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of my own heartbeat for company, and I made a silent promise to myself. I would not beg for a seat at their table. I would not crawl back to a family that had already buried me in silence. If they thought they could discard me, they were about to learn that the girl they had underestimated was no longer a child with shovel and frostbitten fingers, but a woman with scars, with strength, and with something they had never imagined I possessed. For the first time in years, I felt the ember of fury glow beneath the ashes of disappointment, and I knew that this Christmas would not be the story they had written for me. This Christmas would be the beginning of mine. My name is Laura Bennett, and if you have ever given everything you had only to be told you were nothing, then my story is your story too, and I need you to stay with me because what I am about to tell you is not just about one cruel text message or one ruined holiday, but about years of sacrifice dismissed by the very people I thought would be proud of me. I want you to hear this, not because I am searching for pity, but because I know I am not alone. I know there are people watching right now who have carried families on their backs, who have sent money, who have swallowed words and smiled through tears only to be cast aside when the moment came for recognition. Have you ever walked through fire for your family? Not metaphorical fire, but the real kind that sears your lungs and blackens your skin, and returned home with the hope that your scars might finally earn you a seat at the table, only to find the door locked and your name scratched from the guest list. That is where I stood when those 8 words landed in my phone. You are not welcome here this Christmas. Stay away. I had marched through deserts, I had crouched under the thunder of mortar shells, I had pulled brothers and sisters in uniform out of the dirt while blood soaked into my gloves. And yet when it came time for me to knock on my own front door, I was told to turn back like a stranger. So let me introduce myself not as a victim, but as a soldier, a daughter, a woman who once believed that if she just did enough, gave enough, suffered enough, she would finally be seen. My name is Laura, and I was born into a family where my father Richard made it clear from the beginning that sons were built to shine, while daughters were built to serve quietly in the shadows. My mother Margaret whispered warnings to me not to anger him, not to challenge him as if my silence was the price of her fragile peace. My brother Daniel was the chosen one, the golden child, his mistakes repainted as lessons, his triumphs amplified his very presence, celebrated while my achievements were tucked away like shameful secrets. That is the soil I grew from, and when I joined the military at 18, I thought maybe distance would change something. Maybe service would rewrite my place in their story. I imagined coming back draped in respect my uniform, a shield against their indifference. But years passed, deployments stacked, and though I sent checks and called home and begged for even the smallest recognition, the responses never came, or when they did, they came in emojis, in cold half-sentences in the silence of unanswered calls. I thought Christmas would be different. I thought the lights on the tree might thaw the ice in my father's eyes. I thought maybe the smell of my mother's pie would be enough to remind her that her daughter had walked through battlefields and deserved more than whispers. I thought maybe Daniel would set aside his smirk for one evening and just say, "Welcome home." Instead, I got a message that cut every thread of hope I had been weaving. And so, I am here telling you this because maybe you too have a story that begins with hope and ends with betrayal. And maybe you too need to hear that betrayal does not have to be the last chapter. If you know what it feels like to give and still be treated as if you are less, if you have ever stared at a text message that shattered your heart, then lean in close, because what happened next will make you see that sometimes justice does not arrive wrapped in ribbons but carved in legal documents and sealed with signatures. From wherever you are watching this, tell me in the comments where that is because I want to know how far these words can travel, how many miles of disappointment they can bridge, and I promise you, if you stay with me through this story, you will understand why I had to stop begging for a place at their table and build my own. I grew up in the Bennett household in a small Midwestern town where winters came early and stayed long, where the snow piled high against the windows and the cold crept into your bones unless the fire was roaring. My father Richard was the kind of man who believed discipline was the only language worth speaking, and in his eyes discipline meant silence from daughters and obedience from sons. My mother Margaret carried that belief in quieter ways, pressing her finger to her lips when I tried to argue, whispering, "Don't upset him," when his voice rose at the dinner table. And then there was Daniel, my older brother by 2 years, who never had to earn his father's pride because it was handed to him like an inheritance. When Daniel forgot his chores, Richard would laugh and say, "Boys will be boys," but when I missed one shovel of snow from the driveway, he barked that I was lazy and useless. When Daniel came home with average grades, my father said he was saving his genius for the future, but when I brought home straight A's, he asked why I hadn't done extra credit. Every holiday, every birthday, every Sunday supper reminded me that Daniel was the golden son, while I was the ghost at the edge of the room. I learned early that my value was measured not in what I achieved, but in how invisible I could make myself. At 18, suffocated by the constant comparisons and desperate to prove that I was worth more than silence, I enlisted. My father sneered that I would never make it through boot camp, that women weren't built for war, but I carried his contempt like fuel, and every push-up, every mile run, every bruise was a step further away from his shadow. I spent nearly a decade in uniform. I stood watch in deserts where the heat blistered skin and in mountains where the wind cut like knives. I carried a rifle heavier than my body some days, and I carried the weight of lives even heavier. I held the hands of soldiers younger than me as the light left their eyes and I stitched wounds under the roar of helicopters. Through it all, I kept sending money home because no matter how far I was or how much I hurt, I thought maybe if the bills were paid, if the roof was fixed, If my mother had her medication, then maybe I would finally be seen. I wired checks to cover the mortgage when the farm was failing. I sent part of my combat pay so Daniel could cover his debts after yet another failed business venture. And I mailed care packages filled with little things I thought might remind them I was still their daughter. Most of the time, my efforts were met with silence or a thumbs up emoji from Daniel, or a curt message from Richard reminding me that money didn't make up for absence. I missed Christmas after Christmas watching grainy video calls where Daniel unwrapped gifts while I sat in a tent thousands of miles away, pretending the sound of gunfire outside was just another kind of holiday firework. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, every milestone that might have tethered me back to them. And yet I kept hoping, because that is what children do even when they are grown. We keep hoping that one day the people who should love us will choose to. By the time I was 29 and preparing to come home for Christmas, my body carried scars. My heart carried disappointments, but somewhere inside, I still carried the fragile hope that walking up those steps and knocking on that door would change something. That maybe this time my father would look at me with the pride he reserved for Daniel. That maybe my mother would reach out and hold me, without glancing nervously at Richard. That maybe my brother would set aside his smirk and simply say, "Welcome home." That fragile hope is what made the text message feel like shrapnel tearing through my chest, because it wasn't just words. It was confirmation that no matter how much I gave, no matter how much I bled to them, I would always be the daughter who didn't matter. When I left the military, I thought I was finally stepping into a life where I could rebuild myself, a life where my scars might fade beneath sweaters, and where the constant hum of danger would be replaced by the softer rhythm of family gatherings. That December, as Christmas approached, I told myself over and over that this year would be different. I decorated the small apartment I had rented with a cheap plastic tree and a string of lights that flickered like they were tired too, but I imagined that soon I would not be staring at those blinking bulbs alone. I pictured the drive through snow-covered fields pulling into the driveway of the house I had helped save more than once with my paychecks, and stepping onto the porch where the smell of pine would mix with cinnamon and butter as my mother baked pies in the kitchen. I imagined Daniel boasting about his latest project while my father finally maybe looked at me with something other than contempt, maybe even pride. I imagined the clink of glasses, the shuffle of wrapping paper, the sound of laughter filling the rooms that had echoed with silence each time I returned on short leaves, only to find excuses waiting for me. For weeks, leading up to Christmas, I let myself believe, truly believe, that this was the year the pattern would break. I even bought gifts, simple ones, things chosen carefully for each of them, because part of me thought that if I showed them how much I remembered how much I still cared, then maybe they would finally remember me. I wrapped a warm scarf for my mother in the color she always wore. I picked out a watch for my father that I could barely afford, and for Daniel, I bought a set of tools he had mentioned in passing, something to help him with the workshop he claimed he was building. Each package was more than an object. It was a plea for connection wrapped in paper and tied with string, and I stacked them neatly by the door so I would not forget them when I left for the drive. The night before I planned to head out, I sat in the quiet of my apartment with the glow of the tree warming the shadows, and I let myself feel excited for the first time in years. I thought about hugging my mother, about the way her arms might tremble as she finally held me without fear of my father's glare. I thought about walking through the door and hearing my father call me by name instead of just girl or useless. I thought about Daniel looking me in the eye and saying he was glad I was home. That is the cruel thing about hope. It does not fade gently, it shatters. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed, and when I saw my father's name on the screen, I felt a surge of something dangerously close to joy. Maybe he was going to tell me he was proud of me. Maybe he was going to say, "Drive safe, can't wait to see you." My hands shook as I opened the message and read those 8 words that would slice through me like a blade. "You are not welcome here this Christmas. Stay away." I stared at them until the letters blurred and the tree lights burned into my eyes. My throat closed as if the words had reached through the screen and strangled me. Every memory of sacrifice, every night in the desert, every paycheck sent home, every dream of walking into that house crumbled into dust in a single breath. The packages by the door became ridiculous mocking proof of how foolish I had been. My chest ached as though something had been ripped from it. But beneath the ache, something else stirred, something sharper, hotter. For years I had begged with actions, pleaded with sacrifices, bartered with pieces of myself for even a scrap of recognition, and in that moment I understood the truth. They would never give it. They would never see me as equal, as worthy as family. They had chosen their son, their golden boy, and they had chosen to erase their daughter. And so I sat alone on Christmas Eve, the glow of cheap lights flickering against the packages that would never be opened, and I made a promise to myself that was harder than steel. I would never beg again. The morning after that text, I woke up with swollen eyes and a chest that felt caved in, but somewhere beneath the heaviness, a thought kept scratching at me, a memory I had buried under years of exhaustion. I remembered the day my father called me during a short leave. His voice unusually polite, almost desperate. He said the bank was about to foreclose on the house and the farm, that without someone to co-sign the mortgage renewal, the Bennett property would be gone. He said Daniel was too young and too deep in debt, that Margaret could not qualify, and that if I truly wanted to prove myself, I could step up for once in my life. I was 24, then naive enough to believe that his request was a gesture of trust, a crack in the wall of disdain he had built around me. I signed the documents without hesitation, never asking questions, thinking that this was the moment my father might finally see me as reliable as worthy. I walked back to my unit, clutching the carbon copy as if it were proof of love. Years passed, and I never thought about it again until that morning when the sting of his rejection forced me to ask what had ever come of that signature. I dug through a battered metal box where I kept my papers, the folder stuffed with yellowing envelopes and wrinkled forms. And there it was, the agreement with my name scrawled in black ink beside his, the numbers bold and merciless. I ran my finger over the line that spelled it out clearly, the clause that gave me 60% controlling interest in the property, should payments fall behind or equity shift. My breath caught. I read it again slower, careful, as if the letters might rearrange if I blinked. But they did not change. The words were law, and the law was mine. In that instant, the power balance that had defined my entire life flipped like a table overturned. For decades, my father's voice had been the final word, his contempt the currency I lived under, but now I held something he could not shout down. I held legal ownership. I sat there shaking not from fear, but from the electricity of realization, and for the first time since reading his message the night before, I felt something other than despair. I felt fire. Still, I knew fire without direction burns itself out. I needed clarity, and I needed someone who could wield the law like a weapon. That is when I called Evelyn Carter, a friend from the service who had traded her uniform for a law degree. She answered on the second ring, her voice steady warm, the kind of voice that reminded you the world could still be fair. I told her everything in a rush, the text, the years of dismissal, the CO-signed mortgage. She listened without interrupting, and then she asked me to scan the documents and send them. I did, my hands trembling as I fed the pages into the machine. Within hours, she called back. "Laura, she said you are not imagining this. You are the controlling owner of that property. Legally, your father cannot remove you. Legally, you can enforce your rights." My knees went weak, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of possibility. Evelyn went on explaining how the courts would view it, how a judge would interpret the clauses, how Richard and Daniel had likely been skating on my name for years without ever acknowledging it. She spoke calmly like a soldier detailing a mission plan, and I realized that this was no longer just about a broken Christmas. This was about justice. This was about reclaiming the years of silence, the years of sacrifice treated as nothing. I thought of the packages still stacked by my door, the gifts that had seemed pathetic the night before, and I almost laughed because I finally understood. My father had told me I was not welcome in the house. The irony was that the house was not his to deny. It was mine to claim. Once the truth settled into my bones, I knew I could not let it fade like so many other realizations I had buried in the past. This was not a moment to retreat into silence. It was a call to action. Evelyn laid out the plan with the precision of a commander, explaining that the first step was to assert my rights formally. She drafted a letter on crisp legal stationery that outlined in undeniable language the clause of the mortgage, the percentage of ownership, and the immediate consequences if my authority continued to be ignored. When I read the draft, my hands tingled with a mix of fear and exhilaration. It was not flowery or emotional, it was blunt clinical, a document that carried the weight of law behind every sentence. At the bottom of the page, my name was written, not as an afterthought, not as a child begging for acknowledgement, but as the controlling owner of the Bennett property. Evelyn asked me when I wanted to send it, and without hesitation I said Christmas Eve. Let them unwrap their gifts with the letter in their hands. Let them sip their wine while realizing the foundation of their world no longer belonged to them. She raised an eyebrow, but she did not argue. She only asked if I was ready for the storm that would follow, and I told her I had weathered worse storms than Richard Bennett's temper. That evening, we walked the letter to the post office, the snow crunching under our boots, the cold air biting our cheeks. I felt like I was carrying a weapon more powerful than any rifle I had held. We sent it certified tracked impossible to ignore. Then we waited. On Christmas morning, while families across the country were tearing into wrapping paper and children were squealing with joy, my phone began to vibrate. First once, then again, until it danced across the table. Richard's name. Daniel's name. An unknown number that could only have been their lawyer. I let it ring. I watched each call go unanswered, savoring the reversal. For years, I had been the one chasing them, begging for attention, but now they were chasing me. Desperate, panicked, afraid. Hours later, a message from Margaret arrived, her words spilling with tears even through text. "Please, Laura, don't do this. It's Christmas. We can talk." My thumb hovered over the reply button, but then I remembered every Christmas I had spent alone, every time I had watched Daniel celebrated while my service was ignored, every time my father had looked past me as if I were air. I set the phone down and let the silence speak for me. That night, I sat in the glow of the cheap lights in my apartment, the unopened gifts still by the door, and for once I did not feel pathetic. I felt powerful. Evelyn called to check on me, her voice calm as ever. She reminded me that Richard and Daniel would try every angle from guilt to intimidation, but that the law was on my side. I told her I was ready. She believed me, and in her belief, I found the kind of support I had been craving my entire life. The next day, the messages turned from pleading to angry. Richard's voicemail thundered with rage, accusing me of betrayal, of disloyalty, of destroying the family name. Daniel sent me paragraphs dripping with mockery, telling me I was delusional, that no judge would side with me, that I was a joke who had finally lost her mind. But I knew better because I had the papers in my hand and Evelyn's steady counsel in my ear. For every insult they hurled, my resolve hardened. They wanted me to crack, to answer, to flinch. I did none of those things. Instead, I began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Evelyn advised me to have a locksmith ready, a property manager lined up, and copies of all documents in order. We checked every line, every clause, every potential loophole, and when she was satisfied, she looked me in the eye and said, "Laura, you are about to change the course of your life." Sitting in that dim apartment, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm I had only known in the moments before stepping onto a battlefield. It was the quiet before impact, the breath before fire. And for the first time in years, I was not afraid of the storm. I was the storm. The week after Christmas, the snow lay heavy on the Bennett property, drifts piled against the fence lines and smoke curling from the chimney as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I pulled up the driveway with Evelyn beside me, her briefcase resting between us like a shield, and behind us a van waited with the locksmith and the property manager I had hired. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as the house came into view, the same house I had once dreamed of entering with open arms, and now I was approaching it like a battlefield. Richard was already on the porch when we parked, his shoulders squared, his face red, a cigar clamped between his teeth. Margaret hovered behind him, wringing her hands, her eyes swollen from crying, and Daniel leaned against the railing with a smirk that twisted my stomach with the familiarity of every sneer he had ever thrown at me. As I stepped out of the car, Richard's voice thundered across the yard. "You ungrateful girl!" he shouted. "Do you think a piece of paper makes you stronger than blood?" I walked up slowly, my boots crunching in the snow, my breath fogging in the air, and when I reached the porch, I looked him straight in the eyes and said, "No, Dad, it makes me stronger than your lies." Evelyn handed him the official notice, the pages stamped and signed, the law wrapped in black ink that no amount of shouting could erase. Richard tore the papers in half with shaking hands, but Evelyn only handed him another copy from her briefcase, her calmness slicing deeper than any scream. Margaret stepped forward, tears spilling, begging me not to destroy the family. "Please, Laura," she whispered. "It's Christmas. It's tradition. It's your home, too." I felt the ache of her words, but I remembered every Christmas I had spent alone, every time she had chosen silence, instead of defending me, and I said quietly, "It stopped being my home the moment you let him tell me I wasn't welcome." Daniel barked out a laugh, clapping his hands as if the whole scene were a comedy. "You might own some papers, little sister," he sneered, "but you'll never own us. You'll never be more than a pathetic soldier with nothing better to do." The words stung, but they also fueled me. I turned to him, my voice steady. "Maybe I don't own you, Daniel, but I own this house, this land, and every wall you lean against. And today you're going to learn what it means when the daughter you dismissed finally takes her place." He scoffed, muttering that I would never go through with it, but behind me, the locksmith was already unloading his tools, and when the first drill bit whirred into the lock, Richard's roar shook the windows. "How dare you!" he bellowed. "How dare you humiliate me in front of my neighbors, in front of my own wife and son?" I stepped closer, close enough to see the veins bulging in his neck, and I told him calmly, "You humiliated yourself the day you chose pride over your own child." The locksmith worked quickly, each turn of the drill a drumbeat in my chest, until finally the old lock clattered to the porch floor and a new one gleamed in its place. The sound of the bolt sliding into position was like thunder rolling through the sky, the sound of a new era. Richard lunged as if to stop it, but Evelyn stepped between us, her hand raised, reminding him that any violence would only strengthen my case. He froze his fury so thick it seemed to steam in the winter air. Margaret collapsed into a chair on the porch, sobbing while Daniel spat into the snow, his face twisted with hatred. I looked at them all, my family, my blood, and I felt the final strands of hope burn away. This was no longer about begging for love or recognition. This was about survival, about justice, about drawing a line so clear it could never be erased. I turned the new key in the lock, the click echoing like a gunshot, and I said, "This is my house now. These are my rules. You told me I wasn't welcome, and today I'm making that true." The day after the locks were changed, Evelyn and I walked through the house room by room, the silence pressing down like a heavy curtain, and for the first time in my life, I felt the walls listening to me instead of closing me out. Richard and Daniel hovered in the driveway, refusing to leave, their voices carrying threats and curses, but the law was no longer on their side. Evelyn filed the 30-day notice immediately, the document taped to the front door where everyone could see it. It was simple, final, and unshakable. "You have 30 days to vacate or the sheriff will escort you out." Richard ripped it down in a fury, but I taped another one up my hands, steady my gaze unblinking. The neighbors watched from across the snow-covered street, whispering their eyes wide at the sight of the great Richard Bennett brought to his knees by the daughter he had cast aside. For a week, they tried to intimidate me. Daniel pounding on the door at night, shouting insults, Richard calling from blocked numbers, leaving messages filled with rage, but I did not answer. Each attempt only weakened them. Each silence from me reminded them that I was no longer a child to be controlled. Then came the discovery that made my stomach twist with both disgust and grim vindication. In the upstairs hallway, Evelyn found rental agreements stuffed into a drawer, hastily signed documents showing that Daniel had been secretly renting out rooms in the house to strangers for cash, pocketing the money while ignoring the mortgage. There were receipts, texts, even photographs of tenants who had come and gone while I was overseas, sending checks to keep the roof standing. My hands shook as I held the papers, not from fear, but from the clarity of betrayal so blatant it almost felt like parody. They had told me I was not welcome while Daniel was literally selling pieces of my home to strangers. The irony was so sharp I laughed a bitter laugh that startled even Evelyn. This evidence changed everything. Not only did I have controlling interest, I now had proof of fraudulent use of the property. Evelyn's voice was like steel when she said, "Laura, this gives us grounds for immediate eviction." That night I signed the final notice, the ink drying under my hand like the seal of justice. When Richard received the document, his fury turned to something smaller, pettier. A man cornered with no weapons left. He shouted that I was tearing the family apart, that no daughter should ever treat her father this way, but the words rang hollow in the frozen air. Daniel tried to bluster, claiming the tenants had been friends' harmless arrangements, but the signatures told another story, and even Margaret could not defend him. She stood with tears in her eyes, torn between the husband who barked commands and the daughter who finally stood tall. In the end, she chose silence, and silence meant surrender. The weeks crawled by, each day another chip at Richard's pride. He stopped shouting as loudly when neighbors passed. He avoided the mailbox, his once booming presence shrinking into mutters. Daniel skulked around town, his swagger dimmed, whispers following him about scams and failures. By the time the 30th day arrived, the Bennett men were broken shells of themselves. The sheriff arrived, papers in hand, and Richard's face collapsed when he realized this was not just family drama anymore. It was public, it was law, it was final. They packed, hastily shoving clothes into garbage bags, Margaret crying quietly as she folded photo albums. I watched from the doorway, not gloating, not triumphant, but steady, resolute. Each box carried down the steps was a reminder that actions have consequences, that betrayal is not free, that silence has an expiration date. When the last bag was loaded into the truck, Richard turned to me one final time, his eyes filled with a rage muted by defeat. "You will regret this," he hissed. I met his gaze and answered simply, "I already regretted trusting you." And with that, they drove away, the taillights disappearing into the snow, leaving the house finally fully mine. After the truck carrying Richard, Margaret, and Daniel vanished down the icy road, silence settled over the Bennett property like a heavy snowfall. For a moment, I stood on the porch, with the new key warm in my palm, listening to the wind rattle bare branches, and I felt the strangest mix of sorrow and triumph. This was the house that had once been my cage, the house where my laughter had been swallowed by my father's commands, where my achievements had been drowned out by my brother's mediocrity dressed as brilliance, and now it was mine in every sense of the word. I could have locked the door and claimed it as a fortress, a victory carved from pain, but as I walked through the rooms, I realized I did not want a fortress. I wanted something bigger, something that could transform the years of rejection into a legacy of welcome. The idea began quietly as I stood in my old bedroom, the wallpaper faded, the air musty. I thought of the women I had served with the young soldiers who had returned to empty apartments and silent families, the ones who had carried more than their share of burdens, only to be met with doors slammed in their faces. I thought of their hollow eyes and forced smiles, and I knew I could not let this place remain a monument to cruelty. It had to become a sanctuary. With Evelyn's help, I filed paperwork repurposing the Bennett property into what I named the Bennett Shelter, a home for female veterans who had been left behind by the very people they had fought to protect. Within months, the rooms that once echoed with silence filled with voices, with laughter, with the steady rhythm of women rebuilding themselves. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cinnamon as volunteers baked. The living room walls bore photographs of women in uniform, their medals displayed proudly instead of hidden in drawers. Where Richard once barked commands, there were now workshops teaching financial independence. Where Daniel once schemed for money, there were now mentorship circles guiding young veterans through the maze of civilian life. Every nail hammered every bed, made every meal shared, rewrote the story of the house. Reporters came, neighbors whispered at first, and then applauded, and slowly the Bennett name stopped being associated with Richard's arrogance and Daniel's failures. It became tied to resilience, to justice, to healing. Sometimes I would catch Margaret standing at the edge of the property, her hands clutching her coat, her eyes lingering on the lights glowing through the windows. She never approached, never spoke, and I never invited her in. Her silence had built too many walls, but in her gaze I saw the weight of regret. Richard and Daniel never returned. They moved out of state, their pride too shattered to face the town where everyone knew they had been undone by the daughter they dismissed. Their absence did not haunt me. It freed me. On the first Christmas after the shelter opened, I decorated the tree in the living room with the women who lived there, each of us hanging ornaments not as symbols of a past we had lost, but as promises to the future we were building. When the lights flickered on, we stood together, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by the stubborn refusal to remain unwanted. As the snow fell outside and carols played softly on the radio, I felt something I had not felt in years. Belonging. Justice had not come wrapped in ribbons. It had come in the steady hand of a lawyer, in the unyielding ink of documents, in the courage to say no more. But beyond justice came something greater, a sense of purpose that outlived revenge. I lit a candle on the porch that night, not for the family who had turned me away, but for every woman who would walk through that door in the years to come. This was not just my victory. It was our home now, a place where no one would ever be told again, "You are not welcome." If you have stayed with me through this story, then you know that what began with 8 words meant to erase me became a life rebuilt on my own terms, and I want you to take something with you from it. Do not let anyone, not even the people whose blood runs in your veins, convince you that you are less than you are. Do not let their silence or their cruelty define your worth. I was told I was not welcome, and for a moment I believed it, but the truth is that worth is not granted by fathers who sneer or brothers who mock. Worth is claimed when you stand up, when you fight back, when you use every tool you have, even the law itself, to carve out a place where you belong. I did not win by begging for love that would never come. I won by building a home where women like me could walk through the door and know they mattered. And now, as I sit in this house filled with voices instead of silence, with warmth instead of cold dismissal, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been told you were not welcome, not good enough, not worthy? Have you ever given years of yourself only to be met with indifference? If you have, I want you to know you are not alone. There is justice, there is healing, and there is a future beyond the betrayal of those who should have loved you. My name is Laura Bennett, and this is not just my story. It is a reminder that sometimes the family you lose makes room for the family you choose. From wherever you are watching this, tell me in the comments where that is, because I want to know how far these words can travel, how many hearts they can reach. And if you believe in justice and healing, in the strength to rise when others try to push you down, stay with me. There are more stories to tell, and together we will make sure no one ever feels unwelcome again.